So, hello everyone. My name is Ksenia Krasnova, and today we finalize the series Do Cities Dream? It is dedicated to innovations in the environment around us. It is also dedicated to ecological, social, cultural values and objectives of the integration of the technologies. And we are discussing not just the effect of the innovation's existence and effectiveness or ineffectiveness sometimes, but also this sort of new urban landscape around us, so which includes the omnipresent innovations, which could in a way be called even post-digital. So today we have our very, very special guest, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Antoine Picon. Professor Antoine is a distinguished academic and thought leader in the fields of architecture, urban design, and technology. He holds the position of Professor of History of Architecture and Technology at Harvard University. He's also a co-director of doctoral programs, and also he is a chair of the PhD in architecture, landscape architecture, and urban planning. And his professional and academic background has been at the forefront of exploring how technological advancements influence architectural design and our lives. So his extensive body of work includes lots of influential publications and books in the field. And today we are privileged to hear from Professor Picon on digital technologies and sustainable city topic. This lecture will explore the evolution of smart cities, its practical implementation. Attention will also be given to how smart technologies have been woven into fabric of our everyday life and how they have effectively or sometimes not effectively address various urban challenges. So the lecture will also address transformation of urban infrastructure and this sort of convergence of digital and green initiatives in the cities. So I will hand it over to you, Anton.
Be virtually here. Good evening, everyone. So can I have the beginning of the presentation? Thank you. So in sustainability and the integration of digital innovation in the built environment. So around 2008, 2010, the rise of digital technology applied to the city gave birth to the ideal of the smart city, an ideal initially promoted by digital corporations like IBM or Cisco. It's actually IBM who started to use the adjective smart. Following the crash of the dot-com companies, these corporations were at the time eager to find new markets for their product, and their interests were met with enthusiasm by mayors, often confronted with a crisis of governance. Soon other actors joined the movement, and in the early 2010, the enthusiasm reached a kind of peak to the point that the expectation were sometimes bordering the utopian. Smart cities were supposed to fulfill four needs. The first is they were to make cities more efficient by streamlining infrastructure operation. Urban networks, in particular, from water and sanitation to transportation, were to be improved. These found a symbolic expression in the operation room, one of the most heavily publicized one being the one realized for Rio de Janeiro in Brazil by IBM. Smart was also synonymous with the possibility of a more direct contact between citizen and municipal administration. It was supposed to promote local democracy and citizen involvement by enabling the man in the street to connect to the various municipal services. And here we have the Boston 311 app that enabled inhabitants to report problems in their neighborhoods. Third sense, smart meant also a better quality of life, something deemed as essential in a context marked by a growing competition between cities to attract members of the so-called creative class, to use American urbanist Richard Florida characterization. The smart city, in other terms, was meant to be highly livable, with high-end shops, restaurants, to attract this creative class. And finally, smart was supposed to make cities more resilient, to limit environmental waste, and thus contribute to their adaptation to climate change. A famous 2009 experiment by Carlo Ratti and his Sensible Lab at MIT was emblematic of this ambition. It showed, for instance, how the digital could be used to diagnose dysfunctional recycling circuits. The experiment revealed, for example, that a pair of shoes had traveled twice across the United States before being recycled, which was certainly not ideal in terms of sustainability. So we are now 10 years past this peak of enthusiasm for smart city, and it's probably time to take stock of what has truly happened. The first thing to note is that despite its numerous critics, a lot of critique at the time, the smart city dynamic has triumphed all over the world. One doesn't talk as much about it today, but to quote Silicon Valley guru Mark Weiser, article of 1991, The Computer for the 21st Century, the most profound technology are those that disappear. They weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they are indistinguishable from it. In some ways, the smart city has woven itself into the fabric of everyday life, from New York to Moscow and from Sao Paulo to Tokyo. So all over the world, cities have developed smart city strategies, a movement that ignores the boundary between developed and developing country, between the North and the global South. Now, what has happened was not exactly what was initially envisaged. To begin with, the smart city had been envisaged as a holistic development, something ideally unified. In practice, there has been often a multiplication of smart initiative, but not necessarily integrated in a coherent whole. Even in Singapore, for example, the smart strategy are extremely complex and layered. Second, smart cities were supposed to follow a kind of universal model. This is definitely not what has happened. And there are, in particular, striking differences between the West and Asia. In the West, two aspects have taken mainly: infrastructure monitoring and marketplace enabling companies to tap into the riches of urban data. In Asia, from Singapore to China, citizen monitoring have had a much greater importance. So the smart city movement has presented itself as apolitical. It was actually highly permeable to political question. Last but certainly not least, the path towards sustainability that it was supposed to open was not really advanced in that significant a way. What we've seen during the past decades is actually the irresistible rise of environmental questions that are not solvable by smart technology only. Smart technology may actually make cities more vulnerable. They like, as you all know, neither heat nor water. Now, heat waves and floods are going to be far more present in a future dominated by climate change. Here, an illustration taken from an American activist site to illustrate this vulnerability and some of its consequences. So, does it mean that smart and sustainable has not much to do together? Far from me this affirmation. To the contrary. By improving the way cities operate, the digital can definitely contribute to make cities more sustainable, but they are conditioned to make this transition successful. There are actually a number of conditions. But in this presentation, I would like to follow really three threads, which are already quite a lot for an intervention. The first one is the necessity to rethink urban infrastructure. This is perhaps the less immediately evident, and I hope you'll forgive me if I'm somewhat epistemological in that section. What I will argue is that we need to conceive differently infrastructure, and that has long-range implication. Then the second one is about the necessity to organize the convergence between the digital and the ever-increasing presence of nature in cities. And this is a topic that I've been exploring lately. My most recent book is actually on cities and nature. And finally, the need for a true economy of the use of digital technologies in cities. So let's start by infrastructure. Smart technologies have had a profound impact on urban infrastructure insofar that they have allowed to dramatically improve their efficiency. But one must probably go a step further by rethinking profoundly what we call infrastructure and our conception of the way they operate. So let me try to take a few examples to make that clear. The first one is that infrastructure used to operate on an ideal of regularity. Ideally, nothing was to disrupt this regularity. Things were supposed to flow or to function seamlessly without major change, without events, etc. This is not what will happen. This is not what is already happening in the age of the Anthropocene. We are going to be confronted to more frequent extreme events. I mentioned floods, I mentioned drought, etc. Irregularity will be a key dimension of urban life. So, and this is, for example, something we'll find in electricity. If you take electric networks, they are all about streamlining, about making, smoothing the curves of electricity consumption. Today, with diverse sources of energy, heterogeneous sources, we are going to have to manage peaks not only of consumption, but also production. And we need new technology for that, and smart grids are typical of these kind of new technologies. But the challenge of irregularity is something that will mark many other types of infrastructure. So the digital is useful. It enables us, for example, to know in real time what is happening. And by the way, that changes the practice of infrastructure. I often tell my students that when I was their age, we had barely any notion of when the next metro would arrive. We had to trust that things would go smoothly, but we didn't have in real time, the state of the system, etc. I was at the time living in Paris, and the metro could be pretty irregular at times. So today we know in real time what's happening, and this is changing now the practice of infrastructure. For example, you can combine heterogeneous modes of transportation in a city like Paris, but also in other cities. You can combine metro and bus, or bus and cycling, and this is more and more the way urbanites are going to use infrastructure. So in some ways, we have to imagine that the future of infrastructure is no longer in completely closed upon themselves network, but something that goes toward a greater eclecticism in the use of transportation resources. So I mentioned that I would be a little bit epistemological, so bear with me. That's the boring moment. But what is happening is actually as if the traditional figure of networks, one of the big, massive changes with industrialization was the understanding of many infrastructure as networks. It is as if it was gradually subsiding, being replaced by logic which are more eclectic or more itinerary-like. For example, with GPS, you don't need to know whether you are on this network or that network. You just follow an itinerary. And the map on the right is actually the way before the invention of network in the industrial age. For example, roads were perceived as itineraries. So it's as if we are returning to a kind of pre-network representation of infrastructure. So to go back to other issues pertaining to this mutation in infrastructure, what is an infrastructure today? Is it hardware? Is it pipes? Is it machines? Or is it software? On the left, you have a traditional 19th century infrastructure, very early 20th century. It's all hardware. What is Uber today? Is a platform and infrastructure? Yes, but actually the real infrastructure, it's not the fleet of car, it's actually the app. So how do we conceive infrastructure is there again complicated. Then to further complicate, we live in a society in which it's all about connection. And at the same time, larger and larger swath of the city, and the population wants to be autonomous, wants to be disconnected. This is Bed Z, one of the early zero carbon buildings in London, and we're going to see more and more those. So the age of universal connection is also an age of contrasted level of connection. So behind that, there is something even more profound that is taking place, which is a kind of crisis of the old model of the integrated network. I'm back to this idea of the post-network moment. Networks still exist, but they have become extremely difficult to build. For example, Paris is still trying desperately to finish its grand metro plan. Probably China is one of the last places on earth where you can, from scratch, create huge networks in the 19th century, early 20th century style. So where are we going? Will we still have network-like infrastructure? What other models? New ideals of proximity arise. For example, Stockholm has developed what they've called the Hammarby model from the eco-district Hammarby, in which, a long-distance network like sewer, sanitation, etc., are replaced by more local treatment of infrastructure. So all that, where do I want to go? What we used to consider as infrastructure has become a much more contrasted, complex reality than before. It's not only our classical networks, it's things that may mix very different types of resources. It's no longer classic integrated network, it may be very local one. It's it's no longer based on an ideal of regularity, but it has to do with the extreme irregularity of country urban life in the age of the Anthropocene. So a situation that offers opportunity, but which is also full of challenges. And from that perspective, some of the conclusion of a book, which is a classics in urban geography, Splintering Urbanism by British geographers Simon Marvin and Stephen Graham, it's a 2001 book, are still valid. Why splintering urbanism? Because they explain that actually modern life was actually splintering, was fragmenting the city in ways that were not that known before. Ways also in which the far away may be closer than the close by. For example, the city in London is closer to Wall Street than it is to the neighborhoods that surround it. So how do we construct and go on, planning our cities? We need probably to change our conception of infrastructure. So now let me move to another dimension of the environmental challenge after rethinking the infrastructure, which is the necessity to see green and digital converge. So the first thing to say is that if the smart city was the big emerging model in the 2010, what epitomized modernity, a whole range of new perspective on how to create livable cities, it has been replaced to a certain extent by the green city in the past years. And my research, so the green now is more and more embodying, the hopes we place in the future of our cities. And my recent research, actually, I wrote a book on smart cities, but my most recent research has been a book for a French venue on what I've called urban nature. So the green city is evidently a city in which nature is more present at all scale, from buildings to public spaces. It is a city in which nature is not just an ornament, it is a necessity for climate change mitigation. It is also a city, as we all know, in which one must reverse land artificialization, for example, to order for better absorption of extreme rain episodes. It's a city in which wet zones may better protect coastal districts than traditional seawalls. So new figures are emerging. For example, clearly all these parks we see today to manage water. We've seen also urban forest. The previous one was in Asia. Here we're in Madrid, which is planning the largest urban forest in Europe for the decades to come, linked to climate change mitigation. So another way to put that, going back to the theme of infrastructure, is to consider that nature nature in cities, that is, will appear more and more often as a kind of infrastructure. This is what the Chinese sponge city concept already suggests. So now there has been a strong tendency in the past to think green and digital as two separate problems. So my argument here is to say we still have a pressing need for digital tools. Trees are not going to replace computer, but these tools will have to be conceived and used from a different perspective. We need, for instance, and I return to that at the end of this lecture, to think in terms of digital frugality, whereas we still have a tendency to consider that the sky is the limit in the use of digital tools. So above all, again, we need to organize the convergence between smart and green component. In other words, to think hard about the articulation of the digital and urban nature. This might be among the most urgent tasks that we have to address, and it's a multifaceted endeavor that requires a multiplicity of tools. We must, for example, and the digital is one of the best things it can do is help us monitor and model things. We must, for example, monitor and model the behavior of large natural phenomena and systems. From that perspective, water may be among the most important aspects. On the one hand, we must save water, and this all the more that draft episode will multiply in the near future. On the other hand, extreme weather episodes will create specific problems of evacuation of storm water. We're going to live in a very strange future in which sometimes we have too much, sometimes not enough water. So in such a context, digital water management is key. Regarding water supply networks, one of the objectives is to limit leaks with the use of sensors, for example, acoustic sensors. In France, to give you a figure, as an average, 1 liter out of 5 is lost in urban networks because of water networks because of leaks. There are much to do to improve the situation. And here, for example, is a type of acoustic sensor that is currently installed in the Parisian system. With probes also, digital tools will enable also to better follow the level of groundwater table. And groundwater table is all over the world a problem and represent another key element in preparing for the effects of climate change. So besides measuring and monitoring, the digital can also help us model model and simulate. In a number of cases, for example, flooding is a major issue. How does it occur? How can we evaluate what's going to take place? Digital tools are already there. Very often, by the way, this is where AI is also mobilized more and more. AI as a way to study scenario. This is just an ad from Ovarup, who's developed a tool to model the effects of flooding. The digital, and I'll come back also to this issue in a moment, is also super useful to communicate with the public. Communication about extreme scenario and events is becoming a necessity. It's not only about informing in real time about what is going on, it's about educating the public, it's about making him more familiar and conversant with the risk. So if you take the Parisian region, we're relatively blessed. We don't have that many risks, but we have one actually major risk, which is flooding. And the Parisian authority have developed actually a tool with an interactive map. Here it's static, but it's actually an interactive map that enable a large public to follow the risk of flooding according to different hypotheses. So and the thing evolve under the eye of the spectator. So managing natural resources, beginning by water, but a lot of other things. Next, moving to the biological realm, we have the management of natural population from trees to animals. So the digital enables to have comprehensive views of situation in cities. For example, this is also by MIT Sensible City Lab. They have built a tool called Treepedia, which enables to quantify the canopy in various cities. Here, for example, Seattle. But at another scale now, in many major cities, trees are, for instance, monitored using different systems, with among them IoT solution, Internet of Object solution. Going further, and that's probably the most spectacular example, the city of Singapore, which aims to be, and I quote their official literature, a city in nature, has done something even more spectacular. They have planted huge trees, very often equatorial, along their freeways. But when a branch of these huge trees breaks, it can create dramatic accident. So, in order to prevent the accident, what they do is they have actually modeled each single tree using a finite element software. So, in order to be able to predict when the break of branches may happen. So, I don't think we can go as far as Singapore. I don't see Moscow or Paris modeling each branch of each of their trees for sure. That's too expensive. But monitoring is going to develop, modeling is going to develop. In many countries, one is already monitoring digital the population of wild animals. And you can imagine that this is also going to be the case in cities where animals are back and more and more. So let me now move to other dimension of the convergence between the digital and nature in the near future. For example, in Paris, for example, in Paris, there've been the huge success of these planted walls, which looks a little bit, a little bit of tropicality under the gray sky of Paris, though the picture here is blue. But what is less known is that actually this is digitally monitored. Without software, who actually monitor the amount of water and nutrient, this would not function. To give another example, urban agriculture is developing all over the world. It's often associated with relatively some kind of low-tech condition. But should this be the case if we want urban agriculture to become more than a marginal activity, mostly geared toward catering to the nostalgia for a direct contact with nature? What if we want really it to be efficient? And there we can imagine a high-tech agriculture, urban agriculture, which will definitely need digital tools to monitor and to grow vegetables and fruits in non-conventional settings. Another example, in the recent years, we've seen a lot of building integrating plants, even trees, as an essential component. A key example has been the pioneering Bosco Verticale of Italian architect Stefano Boeri in Milan. However, one of the challenges is to go beyond the cut and paste effect. Just putting trees on balconies is not enough. How do you integrate them really into the operation of the building to make them part of, to use a key buzzword today, the metabolism of the building? There again, digital tools will be essential towards this integration, just like they contribute to integrate the various building systems in the overall operation of a building. I could multiply the examples, but I'd like to move towards a broader issue that has to do with a profound change of conceptual frame that is currently taking place. So this issue requires a pedagogy. I'll go back to that in a moment. But this is, almost a change in philosophy. So with the rise of the importance given to natural elements and beings, we need to overcome a series of separation. For example, a narrow vision of technology as dealing mostly with machines. We need, in other words, to move from classic mechanical-oriented system to ecological thinking. Technology is no longer to be envisaged as a series of systems. It should be approached as an environment merging the artificial and the natural, as a techno-nature, to use a term frequently mobilized by science and technology scholars. So let me insist on that. It's actually even a broader change than infrastructure only, to think of technology differently as part of ecosystem. So such a change also regards the way we understand what society is about. As thinkers like the late Bruno Latour have argued, we have to learn to live truly with non-humans, respecting them, considering that they have rights, just like we have. In the age of the Anthropocene, what we call a society is not only groups of humans, it encompasses a series of non-human beings. And, in our cities, we will have more and more to live with plants and animals and to make societies with them. So, this is a perspective that a lot of artists have been explored. There is a thriving artistic scene on those themes. Let me just take a couple of still from a French artist, Pierre Huyghe, who's repeatedly addressed the kind of blurring of the natural and the cities, as well as between humans, animals, and more generally, non-humans. So we need to live differently to rediscover that we're not alone in the world. The world is not only a matter of humans and resources, it's more complex. We need other beings. We already know we need bees, for example, we need flowers, we need trees, we need animals, and they are going to be more present in cities. It's not necessarily easy. There is a very good book by an Australian scholar about crows, very intelligent bird, very social, extremely developed in cities and very disruptive at times. Crows in Tokyo, for example, used optic fibers to make nests. So how do you still have optic fibers and try to live in peace with crows? Not as simple as you might imagine. In Paris, actually, also crows are multiplying. So so I mentioned a couple of times pedagogy. So we have actually to learn or relearn about nature. And I think the digital is very important from that perspective. Let me take a couple of examples. So the first is actually a German app called Naturblick, which was launched in 2015 by the Natural History Museum of Berlin, and which is about helping people to discover plant and animal life in green urban spaces, combining a database with GPS tracking. So there is a kind of double purpose, which is to raise awareness of nature in the cities and to provide an education about what surrounds you, what animal, plants, etc., surrounds you. In a slightly different genre, also coming from Germany, the Germans are especially sensitive to this issue in Western Europe, Moontraub, which is a digital platform which depicts edible vegetation in the city. So it actually encourages you to engage in community-based foraging of fruits, nuts, herbs that grow in public urban space. And you have a map, and the app shows you where to go. So, where do I want to go? Again, after rethinking infrastructure, we need in some ways to completely rethink our cities in relation with the increasing presence of nature. Nature is not only a way to mitigate climate change, it's also a way to pacify social relation. It's a way to make cities more sustainable in all sense of the term, not only physically sustainable, but socially sustainable. And for that, we need actually the connection to the digital. Let me finish. I tried to be not too long so that, if there are any question or reaction, have a little bit of time, by what I call an economy of smart technology. So the first thing to say is that we've been sold by giant corporations, think Microsoft, think IBM, think Apple, think all these people, Dell, whatever, that the digital is totally cheap. We can use it in an unlimited way. It's actually free and, no big consequences, etc. Now we are discovering that this is profoundly wrong. This is profoundly wrong. And this is wrong for a couple of reasons. The first is that actually the digital uses a lot of energy. Now the digital is actually using almost as much energy as civil aviation. So that's first set of problems. The digital is creating also a lot of e-waste, which is so far recycled on continents such as Africa, etc. But this is a huge issue. So the digital is actually energy consuming, it is polluting. So at the same time, we cannot do without it. So what I'm calling is exactly this notion of economy. An economy starts when resources are not infinite, when you have to know where and how you have to decide where and how to spend it. Let me also add that the digital is a solution, but it's also a source of problem. Digital security, hackers, for example, may create huge problems, and there are many other issues like that. So, and there is also the problem of obsolescence. How do software age? How do you replace it, etc. So where do I want to go with all that? That we need, again, a true economy of the digital. We need to invent forms of frugality and even ethics, when to use the digital, when not to use it. Not everything is possible nor wishable. You cannot put sensors everywhere. You have to choose. Most cities around the world cannot afford to do what Singapore does with its trees, etc. So that's a question. And this is the economy. Another question is actually scale. At what scale do we function? For example, we've talked a lot about smart cities, but what about smart region? Many problems are actually more regional than within the limits of a municipality. In Around Paris, for example, the region around Paris, Île-de-France, has launched a smart region initiative, which is very typical of how do we negotiate with scale, because cities are at function at different scale. So how do we articulate different scale from the city proper to the region? So, and this is, so I mentioned France, but this is actually a very general problem. This is, for example, another smart region proposal around Tucson in the US. So, at this scale also, and by the way, it's not a coincidence that very often natural issues in cities should be envisaged at the scale of the region. Take water in Paris. It's actually a regional problem as much as, a narrow problem of the center of the city. So I've taken in this speech finally 3 dimension. I could have taken many, many others, but what about infrastructure? How can we organize the convergence between green and digital? And finally, how to rethink the use of the digital in terms of a true economy, just like the rest. The digital is not an unlimited resource. It's something about which we have to make choices, strategic choices. And these are three among many other dimensions if we want to make our city truly sustainable. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for the lecture. It was very interesting and very insightful. And, we could actually follow the development through it, and I really appreciate it. Thank you again. And you sort of, we have several questions at the moment from our audience, and I will definitely ask those questions. But probably first of all, your lecture, it made me think also about, you mentioned the problem of the scale, and it also made me think about the terraforming in general, and that in a way it is all the part of the even bigger system, because at the moment in Russia and in other countries, as you said, there is this problem of digital region, and people are trying to sort of start to solve this problem, but in the end we are talking about even bigger scale, and some problems are way, way bigger, and it sort of makes me wonder where we are going and what we will see in the near future in terms of like planetary scale in this convergence of green infrastructure and digital solutions, which actually it seems like digital solutions, they are sort of allow this to happen. I would appreciate in case you have an opinion on this topic of global scale.
I think scale is becoming, the problem with the smart city approach is that it ignored scale at the beginning. It was about piling up sensors in cities that could afford it. Now that, smart has become a planetary phenomenon, The question, how do you articulate a smart city and a smart region and a smart country, etc., is becoming an issue. So I think we have to, so just like I said, we have to invent really an economy of the digital. We have actually also to invent a geography of the digital in the sense of the multiscalar reality of it. And we are far so far. We're still, playing with, things are just slightly beginning to connect, which is kind of paradoxical if you think at the same time that the internet is covering the world. But spatially, its spatial application are still, of course, Google Maps is almost everywhere in the world, etc. But still, there is a fragmentation still of smart policies.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah. Thank you. And we have a question. Allow me to read it. One of the questions are city governments in the US using artificial intelligence in managing their cities, and in what areas is it being applied?
It's beginning. Tool for diagnostic for big system, for example. Well, there are a lot of, for policing, for example, there are experiments all over the place. Transportation also, it's still experimental in many respects. It's a heavily debated issue in the US. Former Mayor Bill de Blasio, New York mayor, has entered into a kind of anti-AI crusade. Doesn't prevent actually from transportation networks to police experiments, but we are, very often it's kind of invisible because it's inbuilt, it's more and more inbuilt in the management of systems. But we are just at the beginning. But artificial intelligence, by the way, will raise even more than other things the question of the economy of the digital, because it's actually, in terms of energy, quite consuming training an AI.
Yes, it is. It's true. And this also sort of leads me to another question of this. You said it in your last part about the balance of economy and, well, at the moment, at least the digital infrastructure, both, and also green infrastructure are expensive. And this also leads to a question where and how it will be feasible and at what scale. Yeah. So we have, well, actually, this also made me think about, in one of your lecture, you mentioned the line, and you sort of connected it to this contemporary tendency to sort of stage nature in the cities, to sort of reflect the modern perception and lack of nature within urban environment, and rather than actually sort of providing some solutions and some effective solutions for the cities. So some just some place for events and some tourist attraction place. And I understand myself that I worked with District Renfro on the Resi Park. It also has this thing when they stage different types of nature within the city. And it also made me think, and I would like to discuss it with you. How do you see sort of connection of these trends and the perspectives of the project, which is very significant at the moment and very famous and even popular, the line in NEOM. What is your opinion on this? And isn't there any sort of connection in your opinion?
The line. Oh.
Yeah.
Difficult subject. It's a heavily debated and criticized project. It reflects a very specific political condition, Saudi Arabia. I won't enter into the details, but it reflects I think we are connected to very different types of attitude towards the future. And one is definitely low tech. You have people who say we should have less technology, let's abandon this and that, let's almost abandon digital technology, etc. And then you have ultra tech solution. So NEOM is almost caricaturally on the ultra tech. And paradoxically, both have in common to present themselves as a possible reconciliation with nature. So NEOM, which is the culmination of a kind of demiurgic technology, pretty much all the technology that you can imagine are piled up in this project, is presenting this itself as the epitome of the ultimate natural city. So I think it tells as much about our contradiction. It's a project which I'm interested in because it epitomizes almost the absurdity sometimes of our condition. So I won't comment about whether I think actually the biggest limit very often also the biggest limit for me of NEOM of the line may not be the technology or even 170 kilometers, I don't remember, long building 500 meters high. Perhaps we could do it, but how is it socially livable is another question. So let's not forget that livability is more complex to achieve than technology. And not to mention that, yes, they've done a ton of environmental studies, but, the least one can say is, well, we'll see if they do. I don't think they're going to do it in its entirety, but, we'll see already if they do an experimental section, how it looks.
Yes, it will be very interesting. And the company I have worked for, we also worked for NEOM in their research. So yeah, it's interesting to see how it will go on. They are claiming that this concept of also cognitive city within the line would solve lots of social problems of well-being and comfort in the city. You know about this. They are trying to implement AI in everything to sort of make the comfort of the citizens as maximum as possible to almost predict their wishes.
Well, I'm an historian, so the historian are skeptical people. We bury utopia from the past. So I'm not sure that, well, we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, we will see. So we have another question. I will read it. How can we balance the pursuit of sustainability with the fact that many digital technologies are often polluting and expensive? Is it possible to achieve sustainable development without relying on these technologies at all?
Okay, I think it's an answer at various levels. As I said, we need an economy of the digital. That's to say, when to use it and when not to use it. I don't think we can do without it. I think it's too late. It's the digital is part of the way we function, etc. But we have to make choices, etc., which also include personal life. These little thing consume as much as a fridge throughout the year. And each time you're doing a Google research on your phone, it's as if you were lighting a 60-watt bulb for 10 seconds or something like that. So we need also to discipline ourselves. That's to say, to use these things. So far, we're a little bit like people who've been starved and all of a sudden are offered free food, free buffet. So we eat too much and we may end up with an indigestion. So I think we need probably to learn even personal frugality in relation. Constantly streaming video may not be the best use of the internet. Constantly, doing little games on your phone, etc. So I think we need, in some ways, to be grown up in the use of the digital, which now we're more stuck in the 5 years old regime.
Well, it also kind of has this wonderful bridge to the next question from an audience. I will read it. How does the concept of post-humanism align with the ethics and practices of the smart cities, how you see them as a historian? And also there is a connected question, I believe it's the same person, with the how do you anticipate the changes associated with the second demographic transition implemented in this context?
Clearly, the post-human is one of the things at stake in the smart, but also green. For me, there is, by the way, let me be clear, I think the post-human is very human by the end. We've dreamt of being more than human or differently human since the dawn of mankind. So we invented the angels, cyborgs, werewolves, and vampires, which are all avatar of humanity. So, but I would say there are two major fiction today. The post-human is partly a fiction, but which tell us something about who we are. The first is the technologically augmented individual, which is clearly has been one source of inspiration. Think of all the Hollywood cyborg and etc. And the second, which is more linked to the kind of green, is a post-human in the sense of somebody who is meeting with a non-human at a new level of sharing with a non-human instead of trying only to dominate it, etc. People, for example, well, nevertheless, all this literature. I'm thinking of Anat Singh. I'm thinking of others. There is an abundant body of literature. Even Donna Haraway, for example, recent writings are going in that direction. So I think yes, the question post-human means being differently human for me. I think the question, how do we live with technology, but above all, how do we live with other living creatures, is what is at stake today. And with the idea that cities are not only populated with humans, they're populated, to give an example, we're going to have to live with birds, as I say, with trees, but also with algorithms. So, and which are going to be more and more present in our lives. So, how do we find an equilibrium with all these creatures that will co-live with us?
Yeah, it is very interesting, this sort of new definition of nature around us. So we have another question. I will read it. Antoine, what can be done in the sphere of digital innovations for small cities, around 100 or 150,000 people, with their limited municipal budget?
Well, I'm not a prophet. So, well, define small. For France, for example, that wouldn't be a small city.
True. Yeah. For the States,
or,
it's also not a small city.
for China, it would definitely be a village. But um,
Well,
I
for
think
Russia too, it's a small
it
city
is
for us.
clear that you cannot afford, in Manhattan or central Paris, you can pile as many sensors as you want. It's still sustainable, quote unquote, because, there is money, power, etc., etc. You don't have the same resources. I think there are a number of things which are important. I think, for example, for city to take back the control of their data is, for example, an example, so that actually they can use it as a negotiation tool with various companies, etc. I think that's, for example, something very concrete, politics of data in cities that you can do. And then, you have probably also have regional initiative. You may be a small or middle-sized city, but in a region. So, which is another reason why we need more regional initiative. Functioning networks with other cities, pooling resources, just like in other domains.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the data could be the basement, basically, for those cities. Yeah, to start the starting point for them. So we have another question. What is a current example of a city that is moving toward the goal of both green and digital? I would also probably add from myself, maybe you could name a city you think is successful achieving this goal, or at least on the right path, in your opinion.
I would say Western Europe, Vienna probably would be a good example of a city which has succeeded. But guess what? The sad truth is, the richest the country and the city, etc., the usually better they are. Oslo is probably more on the way than cities in which things are more complicated. I think the real challenge is not I think the real challenges will be what about big metropolis in Africa, for example, that kind of thing. But, otherwise, Vienna, for example, has been pretty successful in a number of domains of achieving a certain level of sustainability. It's not only the digital, for example, in Vienna, it's also that they have relatively cheap housing compared and a lot of social housing. So that helps. That it's not only about digital, it's about a lot of other things. Scandinavian countries have been not bad at all, but they have more resources, etc. So no mystery there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's sort of well, you touched upon this topic, but how do you see these unique challenges for the developing countries they face in implementing both smart and also, well, there are digital inequality, and there's also climate sort of inequality in a way. So how do you see them to overcome the obstacles and
There've
benefit?
been success story, among the cities who's done pretty well. Medellin has
Mm-hmm.
done in Colombia has done pretty well, with usually, let's say, smart alone doesn't solve problem. You must be smart about something, transportation, housing, presence of nature. So smart is a tool. It's not, it's not the ultimate objective. Then I would say, in Africa, I think let's hope the the demographic transition, takes. It's very hard to be sustainable when basically you were talking when each year you have thousands of new inhabitants. I think in Africa, for example, the relation between cities and countryside may be one of the issues. But there are so many, take South Africa, security issues, for example, also big problems.
Mm-hmm. We have another question, and it's about Harvard. Do Harvard students implement any innovations either on Harvard campus or in Cambridge?
Well, Harvard is trying, like every major university, to be more green than before. Uh, I would say it's succeeding partly. America is also the country of waste. But for example, I'm no longer having a trash can in my office. It's all so they've put collective trash can in which we're supposed to recycle. It's a pain in the ass, I have to say, because to throw a paper, I have to go to the corridor to etc.
Precisely.
But it has it's very stupid, and I've protested again and again against it. But it seems that it's actually efficiently reducing the amount of waste.
Mm-hmm.
So
So
Harvard is also trying. We have a Center for Green Buildings and Cities,
mm-hmm.
who is actually chaired by one of my colleagues, Ali Malkawi, and they're working on, how to improve housing condition, etc. I think Harvard does what many universities do. They have initiative also, etc. I would say that America is still the country in which you throw away a lot of things. Food you throw away, cups, plastics, etc. So we're still far, but we might be getting there at some point.
I see. Yeah, thank you. And also, we have probably connected question, maybe from the same person. Do you consider Cambridge a sustainable city or digital city?
Digital up to a certain point, sustainable, I'm not sure, given the price of the real estate. Frankly, it's, if that's the price for sustainable, I don't think this is very sustainable. I think Cambridge is an exception. You have two large universities, MIT and Harvard in Cambridge, a lot of .com and biotech companies. So it's a bubble of tech, of academia, etc. It's not a model for any other city. It's something very peculiar.
And probably the last question, maybe you can give us a glimpse into what do you think is the most promising direction for any research in future for you and for Harvard in this direction of studying smart and green cities?
Difficult question. Honestly, I don't know because I'm somebody who is in, as I said, I'm an historian interested in what's happening today. But and historians are good at predicting the past, not the future. Uh, Perhaps let me just share a conviction. I was trained in science and engineering before becoming an historian, and I think today, just like green and digital, you have people who are anti-tech and people who think everything can be solved with tech. I am among those who believe, to be honest, I'm among those who believe that's going to look very technological, that without technological innovation, we won't make it in terms of sustainability, climate change, etc. So I do believe that we need a lot of technological research. And we need at the same time a lot of research on softer research on how do we live together, how do we mobilize nature in cities in interesting way, how do we redesign parks and urban forests. So we need design informed by an understanding of society, and we need hard-boiled tech, and we need the two of them.
Combination of those two. Yeah, I understand. Thank you. And we have another question, and probably this one will be the last one. What role can ordinary people play in making cities more sustainable and environmentally friendly, in your opinion?
Well, things at various level. I think already, as I said, think a little bit what you're doing with your smartphone. Think a little bit what you're doing with your trash. So, recycling, trying to use less resources when not needed, etc. Seems to me. So there is a question of personal ethics and personal lifestyle, which have to change. But that's not enough. I believe also that it's a political issue. So it's also so you must participate in the overall political life of your country and your city. Because some things are not only individual choices, there are things that you must be decided collectively. But there is a personal aspect of things. Frugality is definitely something for the near future to be achieved.
Okay, so thank you. This was the last question. Unfortunately, we don't have time to ask all of them. And as we conclude this interesting lecture, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to Professor Antoine Picon for sharing your invaluable insights. And thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, and have
So
a good
yeah,
evening.
Yeah, I will just say a couple of words to end. This lecture series has been an incredible journey, and through evolving the landscape of architecture, technology, and urban planning. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers who have contributed to this series. And we hope that the ideas and insights gained here will inspire everybody and inspire continued exploration and the dialogue in the field of urban technology and beyond. So please contact me, and thanks to American Center, and contact American Center in case you have any questions or proposals. So thank you all for your participation, and let's stay in touch.